There is a structural pattern that operates before any conscious attempt at change, and this pattern silently determines which experiences tend to repeat over time. It is not visible on the surface of behavior, not in isolated actions, nor in external circumstances. It exists in the internal organization that precedes all of that. Before any action occurs, before any interpretation is made, before any decision is perceived as a choice, there is already an internal arrangement that determines what will be considered possible, what will be ignored, and what will be reinforced. This arrangement does not arise consciously. It is formed through repetition. Repetition of thoughts, repetition of emotional responses, repetition of interpretations, and, most importantly, repetition of identification with certain internal states. Over time, this repetition stops being perceived as something that is happening and starts being perceived as something that just is. That is the point at which the system stabilizes. Once this system stabilizes, it begins to operate as an automatic filter. This means that reality is not experienced directly. It is filtered, interpreted, and organized based on what is already internally consolidated. The brain does not seek absolute truth. It seeks coherence. And coherence requires that everything perceived be compatible with what already exists as a pattern. This creates a continuous effect. What is inside influences what is perceived outside, and what is perceived outside reinforces what is inside. This cycle becomes self-sustaining, and until it is interrupted or reorganized, it tends to repeat indefinitely. And this is exactly where most people stay stuck. Not because they lack potential, but because they never become aware of the pattern that's running everything in the background. So before we go deeper into this, take a second. If what you're hearing right now is making you see your own patterns more clearly, if something is starting to click in a way it never did before, then subscribe to the channel. Because this kind of awareness is not common. And once you start seeing these structures, you can't go back to seeing things the same way again. And the next part will go even deeper into how to actually reorganize this system in a practical way. If what I'm saying makes sense to you, and you feel ready to deepen this experience, I've left a more complete material in the pinned comment. You don't need to look at it now. Just remember it when the time feels right. Most attempts at change fail precisely because they ignore this mechanism. People try to alter what is external, behavior, environment, strategy, without changing what sustains how those things are perceived and maintained. This creates a misalignment. The action points in one direction, but the internal system continues operating in another. This misalignment does not appear in a logical way. It shows up as a constant sense of effort, difficulty maintaining consistency, a tendency to interrupt processes halfway through, and a frequent return to previous patterns. This is not a lack of discipline. It is structural functioning. The first component of this system is identity. Identity is not a superficial concept or a verbal definition. It is an internal pattern that determines what is recognized as familiar. And what is familiar tends to be maintained, regardless of whether it is functional or not. The function of identity is to preserve coherence. It acts as a constant reference point. Everything that happens is compared to this reference point. If something is aligned, it is accepted easily. If it is not, it generates resistance. This resistance is not necessarily conscious. It can appear as doubt, procrastination, loss of interest, or simply difficulty with continuity. The central point is that anything not aligned with identity requires additional energy to sustain. The most common structural failure is trying to change behavior without altering identity. This creates a divergence. The action attempts to establish a new pattern, but the identity continues to sustain the old pattern. This conflict must be compensated for with effort. At first, this effort may be enough, but over time, it becomes unsustainable. And when it becomes unsustainable, the system returns to the original pattern, because that pattern requires less energy to maintain. The structural correction is not about increasing effort. but about reducing the distance between action and identity. This does not happen through an immediate decision. Identity does not respond to logic. It responds to repetition. The more an internal state is repeated, the more familiar it becomes. And the more familiar it is, the more it is incorporated into identity. This process does not depend on intensity. It depends on consistency. The second component is the pattern of thought. Thoughts do not arise randomly. They follow pathways. These pathways are built through repetition. The more a thought is repeated, the easier it becomes. The function of thought within the system is to reinforce what is already established. It acts as a continuous validation mechanism. It does not question the pattern. It sustains the pattern. This means that even when a person tries to think differently, the old pattern remains active, and if the new thought is not repeated enough, it does not consolidate. The structural failure here is trying to eliminate old thoughts without creating a new pattern. This creates temporary instability, but does not produce real change, because the system tends to return to what is already consolidated. The consequence is the feeling that nothing changes, even when there is conscious effort. Structural correction requires progressive substitution. It is not about eliminating a pattern, but about weakening it through lack of repetition and strengthening another through consistent repetition. The third component is the emotional state. Emotions are often interpreted as reactions, but within the system, they function as indicators of coherence. When there is alignment between identity, thought, and perception, the emotional state tends to be stable. When there is misalignment, discomfort arises. This discomfort does not mean the direction is wrong. It means the system does not yet recognize that pattern as familiar. The common mistake is interpreting this discomfort as a sign that something is not working. As a result, the person interrupts the process before the new pattern consolidates. The consequence is reinforcement of the old pattern because it continues to be the most stable. Structural correction requires tolerance for initial discomfort, not as forced effort, but as an understanding that the system is in transition. The fourth component is perception. The way reality is perceived is not neutral. It is filtered. This filter is based on internal patterns. The brain selects what seems relevant, and what seems relevant is whatever is already compatible with what existed internally. This creates a validation cycle. The person perceives what confirms the pattern and ignores what does not. The structural mistake is believing that perceived reality is objective, when in fact, it has already been filtered before being interpreted. The consequence is that the system reinforces itself automatically, without the need for conscious effort. Structural correction is not about forcing a new perception, but about changing the internal pattern. When the pattern changes, the filter changes. And when the filter changes, perceived reality changes. The fifth component is repetition. None of these elements consolidate without repetition. A single thought changes nothing. A single emotion changes nothing. A single action changes nothing. The function of repetition is to transform what is unstable into something stable. The common mistake is stopping before that stability is reached. The consequence is constant restarting. Structural correction requires enough continuity for the new pattern to stop being an attempt and become a reference. The sixth component is time. Time does not act alone. It works together with repetition. Without repetition, time does not create change. Without time, repetition does not consolidate a pattern. The common mistake is abandoning the process in the interval between beginning and consolidation. The consequence is that the old pattern remains dominant. Structural correction is allowing the process to pass through this interval without interruption. The seventh component is alignment. When identity, thought, emotion, and perception begin to operate in the same direction, the system stabilizes. At that point, action no longer requires constant effort. Perception stops reinforcing the old pattern, and behavior begins to automatically reflect the new pattern. This is the point at which change stops being an attempt and becomes continuity. And until this point is reached, any attempt at external change tends to be temporary because the internal system has not yet been reorganized. From the moment these components begin to be understood as parts of the same system and not as isolated elements, the dynamics of change stop being interpreted as an attempt and start being understood as reorganization. This is fundamental because as long as change is treated as an attempt, it depends on continuous conscious effort. When it is treated as reorganization, it depends on structural consistency. The critical point here is understanding that none of these components operates independently. Identity influences thought. Thought influences emotion. Emotion influences perception. And perception reinforces identity. This chain is not linear in terms of a beginning and an end. It is circular. And precisely because it is circular, it becomes self-reinforcing. When a single element of this system is changed consistently, it begins to generate impact on the others. But when the change is inconsistent, the system tends to absorb that variation and return to the dominant pattern. This happens because the system does not respond to isolated events. It responds to repeated patterns. Most approaches fail because they try to act on multiple points at the same time without sufficient stability in any of them. This creates fragmentation. Fragmentation prevents consolidation. Without consolidation, there is no structural change. That is why effective reorganization does not begin with complexity. It begins with focus. Choosing one entry point in the system and maintaining consistency at that point until it starts to influence the others. This entry point can be thought, internal state, or interpretation. What matters is not which point is chosen, but the consistency of repetition. When there is sufficient repetition, the system begins to recognize that new pattern as relevant. This recognition is not immediate. It happens gradually. And during this process, the old pattern remains active. It is precisely in this interval that the highest rate of interruption occurs, because the new pattern is not yet strong enough to sustain itself, and the old one is still dominant. This creates a sense of instability. This instability is often interpreted as failure, but structurally, it is an indicator of transition. The system is being exposed to a new pattern, but has not yet fully incorporated it. Failure happens when this instability leads to an interruption of repetition, because without repetition, the new pattern loses strength, and the system returns to the previous pattern, not by conscious choice, but by structural predominance. For reorganization to occur, it is necessary to move through this phase without interrupting the process. This does not mean maximum intensity. It means minimum continuity. Minimum continuity is the ability to keep the process active even with low energy, even with doubt, even without external evidence of results. This is what allows the new pattern to accumulate strength over time. Another critical point within this system is how validation is perceived. Most people seek external validation to confirm that something is working. But within this type of structure, initial validation is internal. This means that before any external evidence appears, the internal system needs to recognize the new pattern as stable. And this recognition happens through consistent repetition, not immediate results. The structural mistake here is depending on external evidence to continue. This creates a dependency that interrupts the process before consolidation. The consequence is that the system never reaches the point where it sustains itself. Structural correction requires reversing this logic. Continuity cannot depend on results. Results become a consequence of continuity. Another element that directly interferes with this process is how inconsistencies are interpreted. During reorganization, inconsistencies will occur. The old pattern will still appear, old thoughts will still arise, misaligned emotions will still be felt. The common mistake is interpreting these occurrences as regression, when in fact they are just remnants of the previous pattern that is still active. The consequence of this misinterpretation is abandoning the process, or constantly trying to restart, which prevents accumulation. Structural correction requires treating inconsistencies as part of the process, not as a failure of the process. The standard shifts from perfection to predominance. In other words, the new pattern does not need to be present all the time. It needs to start appearing more frequently than before. That is the real indicator of change. Another relevant point is the tendency to accelerate the process. When a person notices some initial progress, there is a tendency to try to expand, add new variables, and increase complexity. Structurally, this is a mistake because the system is not yet fully stabilized. As introducing new variables increases the risk of fragmentation, the consequence is loss of consistency and eventually a return to the previous pattern. Structural correction requires maintaining simplicity until the pattern is consolidated. Expansion comes after stability, not before. It is also important to observe the role of attention within this system. Attention directs repetition. Whatever receives more attention tends to be reinforced. If attention remains focused on the old pattern, even if there is an attempt to change, the reinforcement is still happening in the previous direction. The structural mistake is trying to change behavior without changing the focus of attention. The consequence is that the old pattern continues to be fed. Structural correction requires consciously redirecting attention toward the new pattern, especially at the beginning of the process. Over time, this redirection is no longer necessary because the system itself begins to prioritize the new pattern automatically. Another important aspect is the relationship between effort and naturalness. In the beginning, any new pattern requires effort. This is unavoidable. But the goal is not to maintain constant effort. The goal is to move through the initial phase until the pattern becomes natural. Failure happens when effort is interpreted as something permanent. This creates resistance to the process. The consequence is abandonment before automation. Structural correction requires understanding that effort is temporary. It exists only until repetition is sufficient to reduce the cost of execution. When that happens, the behavior changes category. And it stops being something that must be consciously initiated and becomes something that happens automatically. At that point, the system enters a new state of equilibrium. And it is from this state that external results begin to reflect the internal pattern more consistently. But until that point is reached, the process depends on continuity, simplicity, and controlled repetition. Any attempt to accelerate, add complexity, or seek external validation prematurely tends to interrupt the process before consolidation. When all these elements are observed together, it becomes clear that change does not happen at the moment a new action is executed, nor when a new thought arises, nor when a new decision is made. It happens when a new pattern begins to occur more frequently than the previous one. This point is not immediately visible because it does not depend on isolated events. It depends on predominance. Predominance is the true criterion of transformation within this system. It is not necessary to completely eliminate the old pattern for a new one to be established. What is necessary is for the new pattern to occur frequently enough to be recognized as the new reference. This recognition is not conscious, it is functional. The system begins to operate according to what is most repeated. This completely changes how change must be approached. It is no longer an attempt to immediately replace something, but a process of gradually shifting predominance. This shift does not require perfection, it requires continuity. Most people fail at this point because they use the wrong criterion. They try to achieve absolute consistency from the beginning. When that doesn't happen, yes, they interpret it as failure and interrupt the process. But absolute consistency is a consequence, not a starting point. The starting point is enough repetition to change the relative frequency between patterns. And this only happens when the process is maintained even in the presence of inconsistency. Another critical factor is how progress is measured. When progress is measured only by external results, there is an inevitable delay between cause and effect. This delay creates the impression that nothing is happening, even when the internal system has already begun to reorganize. This interval between internal reorganization and external evidence is the point of greatest risk for interruption, because it requires continuity without visible confirmation. The structural mistake here is depending on external confirmation to continue an internal process. The consequence is stopping at exactly the moment when the system begins to shift. Structural correction requires changing the validation criterion. Instead of observing only external results, observe the frequency of the new internal pattern. If it is appearing more often than before, the system is already in transition. This type of observation reduces the need for immediate external validation and allows the process to continue until consolidation. Another relevant point is the tendency to interpret relapses as a complete reversal. Within this system, a relapse does not erase accumulated progress. It simply indicates that the old pattern still has strength. The difference between interruption and continuity lies in the response to that relapse. If it leads to abandonment, the system returns to the previous pattern. If it is absorbed and the process continues, the new pattern keeps growing. This means that stability does not come from the absence of failure, but from the ability to maintain the process even when failures occur. This understanding completely changes the relationship with error. Error stops being a breaking point and becomes a neutral element within the process. From this point on, the system begins to develop a fundamental characteristic: autonomy. Autonomy means it no longer depends on constant conscious control. Decisions begin to align automatically with the new pattern. Perception begins to filter according to that pattern, as emotional responses begin to follow this new organization. When this happens, effort decreases dramatically, because the system is no longer being forced to operate in a direction it does not recognize. It begins to operate in coherence with the pattern that has been consolidated. This is the point at which change stops being perceived as something you are trying to do and becomes something that is happening naturally. And it is exactly at this point that external results begin to consistently reflect the internal pattern, not as coincidence, not as an isolated event, but as a direct consequence of the internal reorganization that has been maintained over time. The practical application of this needs to follow a simple logic, because any excessive complexity increases the risk of interruption. First, it is necessary to choose one specific internal pattern to work on, not multiple, not vague. One pattern that is clear enough to be identified and repeated. Second, it is necessary to observe which thoughts, interpretations, and states are associated with this pattern. Not to overanalyze, but to recognize what needs to be repeated. Third, begin consciously repeating this pattern, even if it does not yet feel natural. This includes thought, internal state, and interpretation of situations. Fourth, maintain this repetition consistently, without interrupting it due to the absence of immediate external results. Fifth, observe how frequently this pattern begins to appear spontaneously. This is the indicator that the system is starting to incorporate the new pattern. Sixth, avoid introducing new variables before this pattern is stable. This prevents fragmentation. Seventh, adjust only when necessary, and always based on observation, not expectation. If this process is maintained, the internal system will inevitably reorganize. And when it reorganizes, behavior changes, perception changes, decisions change, and as a consequence, external results change. Not because there was direct control over the external, but because the internal system stopped sustaining the previous pattern. In the end, what determines what you experience is not what you occasionally try to do. It is the pattern you sustain repeatedly until it becomes automatic. And when that pattern becomes automatic, results no longer depend on conscious effort. They become the natural consequence of what has already been stabilized within. And if you made it all the way here, there's something important you need to recognize. Most people don't reach this level of understanding, not because it's complicated, but because it requires attention, patience, and the willingness to look beyond surface-level change. So, if this perspective shifted something in you, if you're starting to see that change is not about forcing results, but about reorganizing what sustains them, then this is exactly the kind of content you need to keep exposing your mind to. Subscribe to the channel because everything here is designed to help you understand and apply these deeper structures. And more importantly, so you don't fall back into patterns you've already started to outgrow. If this message truly resonated with you, if you felt that quiet inner shift, that sense that your mind is ready for something greater, I left a resource in the pinned comment that goes deeper into this process. I only recommend it for those who feel genuinely ready to accelerate their results, but follow it in your own time. If it calls to you, you'll find it there. If this feels confusing, it's because it didn't start here. In the previous video, I showed the structure behind all of this, the identity and patterns that define what you allow or block without realizing it. And if you don't see that first, you won't recognize what's happening now. So watch the previous video, because when you connect both, you stop reacting late and start seeing the shift as it begins.